Hello, welcome to the Spotlight. When it comes to the JCPOA or the Iran nuclear deal, one party has done its best to stay in the deal and stick to its commitments. That party is Iran. Unlike the European partners who have not lived up to their commitments, or the U.S., which pulled out of the deal altogether. Well, Iran now says that the U.S. needs to cease its violations of the 2015 nuclear deal without preconditions and drop its addiction to sanctions, stressing the Islamic Republic is not indebted to the other parties as it was fully committed to the agreement, though it did not reap the benefits of the accord. In this edition of the Spotlight, we will look at the survival chances of this deal.
Iran's ambassador to the International Atomic Energy Agency says until U.S. sanctions are not removed, no one should expect more forbearance from the Islamic Republic. Qasem Gharibabadi told the IAEA's Board of Governors Iran's nuclear activities, including enrichment at higher levels and production of metallic-based uranium fuel, are completely peaceful, under IAEA safeguards and in line with the country's rights under the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty.
They asked Iran to go back to the full implementation of its commitment under the deal. So I said, no, it's not possible. So our nuclear program will continue. And if there are some specific actions that we have taken and are going beyond and are beyond the JCPOA provisions, we will suspend them only in case of lifting of sanctions.
Gharibabadi criticized the European signatories of the deal for refusing to condemn the illegal unilateral withdrawal of the US. Apparently, he said, they intend to switch the places of victim and violator. Talks between Iran and the remaining signatories of the JCPOA have not resumed since June. The aim of the negotiations, in which the US took part indirectly, is to bring Washington and Tehran back into full compliance. Iran says the outcome of talks to revive the nuclear deal should be the effective and verifiable removal of all US sanctions and guarantee that disastrous decisions like the US withdrawal and violations do not reoccur. Iran also informed the board that one of the IAEA's equipment was destroyed in an act of sabotage, widely blamed on Israel, targeting an Iranian nuclear workshop. It's regrettable, Gharibabadi said, that the agency has failed to take a clear position on such terrorist acts against the civilian nuclear facilities of its member states. Homalezgi, Press TV, Vienna.
All right, for this edition of the Spotlight, let me introduce our guests. We have Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author, who joins us from London. Also joining us is John Bosnich, journalist and political analyst, who joins us from Belgrade. Let me first start with you, Marcus Papadopoulos, if I may. Let's take a look at the U.S. and the European demands, which go pretty much hand in hand, in a matter of speaking. They want Iran to stop its nuclear program, in which billions have been spent and remain under the strictest inspection regime ever, based on the IAEA's history, as far as it's been said. And it wants also Iran to stop its regional influence. It wants Iran to stop its rocket program. How should Iran respond to these types of demand?
Well, that Joe Biden pursues an antagonistic approach towards Iran and the Iranian people demonstrates the delusional approach that many commentators in both America and in Britain took regarding Joe Biden, because these commentators hailed the man as a savior who would bring peace and stability to the Middle East. And such a sentiment really does amount to delusion and simple-mindedness, because Biden is as bloodthirsty as the Trumps, the Obamas, the Bushes, and the Clintons of this world in seeking to maintain and strengthen American global hegemony. And that includes in enhancing America's supremacy in the Middle East. And in relation to Iran, it should have been very obvious to commentators in both Britain and America that Joe Biden has no love for Iran, no love for the Iranian people, and no love for the Iranian revolution, because he has publicly declared himself on more than one occasion as, and I quote, a Zionist. Now, in relation to the JCPOA, this is really a matter of inversion at its most inverted, because ever since the JCPOA came into force in 2015, Iran has honored all of its obligations. That is quite simply an irrefutable actuality. Whether you like Iran or not is absolutely irrelevant, because, as I said, the Iranian authorities have complied with all of their responsibilities. America, however, as we know, in 2018, withdrew from the agreement. So the ball, so to speak, was in the court of the Europeans, specifically the British, the French, and the Germans, to ensure that the JCPOA continued to function. But alas, despite some promising talk from Berlin, Paris, and London since 2018, the stark reality is that the Europeans, coming under the influence of Washington, and especially the British, have started to accuse Iran of being the reason for why the JCPOA is not moving forward, which is absolutely outrageous. It is absolute nonsense. There is nothing more that Iran can do. Iran has dignity. Iran is a self-respecting state. It has remained a signatory to the treaty. The Americans have left. Joe Biden has no intention whatsoever of rescinding the sanctions that Trump placed on Iran, because Biden loathes Iran as much as Trump does.
Okay.
Therefore, it is down to the Europeans, but the Europeans are failing to actually fulfill their obligations to the JCPOA.
John Bosnich, this is what the Iranian ambassador to the IAEA has said. It is as if these countries have forgotten that it was Iran that complied with all its obligations under the agreement, yet did not enjoy the benefits due to U.S. law-breaking measures and the Europeans' inaction. Apparently, these countries seek to replace the victim with the lawbreakers. Who is the audience for the U.S. and the Europeans portraying Iran as being the one that's breaking the agreement, that's pulling out of the agreement and not fulfilling its commitments?
Well, unfortunately, the public audience is the citizenry of the United States, because before the United States takes any military action or pinpoint strikes, as they call them, they usually soften up potential public opposition. So they are now attempting to paint Iran with the brush of a violator of an international agreement, which Iran is not. They are now enhancing the propaganda that Iran poses a severe and imminent threat to Israel, because there's a very strong pro-Israeli lobby in the United States. And at the same time, they are compounding the decades-long American demonization of Iran and the Iranian people. These are telltale signs of preparation for war. Unfortunately for the Americans, and fortunately for peace and for the people of Iran, both Russia and China have made it clear that they do not support this kind of illegal pressure on Iran. And in somewhat of a surprise, the normally totally gung-ho Europeans are even being a little bit soft in their cheering for their American masters, and they are holding back on calling for any further heightening of tensions. So if Iran is successful It can only be by reaching the public of the West, reaching the powers that be in Europe, where America is pushing people around too much, and hopefully letting the world realize that you cannot just say that something is a certain way if it isn't that way. Iran has complied.
But that's what they're doing.
Unilaterally withdrew. That's the fact.
But that's what they're doing. Let me come to you, Marcus Papadopoulos, to read to you the E3 statement here and ask your reaction. I'm going to go further down first. It says, we appreciate the intense efforts of the IAEA Director General to engage with Iran. We welcome the joint statement between the Director General of the IAEA and the head of the Atomic Energy Organization of Iran, which confirms that IAEA's inspectors will be permitted to service the identified equipment. One positive paragraph, but then here we have Iran has no plausible civilian reason for such activity. Iran has started the process of doubling its production rate of high-enriched uranium. Iran has continued to stockpile uranium enriched to 20%. And I'm just reading the first sentence of each paragraph that condemns Iran. So here you have Iran saying, okay, interim agreement, 3 months, kind of saying to the IAEA, here's another chance. Our cooperation as an NPT member, so forth, to show our true colors. But yet they come out with these types of statements. This has been the way that Iran has been painted all along, hasn't it?
Indeed, and I would take it much further. Ever since the Iranian Revolution, Iran and the Iranian people have been vilified. Indeed, the vilification of the Iranian people and of Iran is one of the worst that the West has carried out in contemporary times. But then there should be no surprise about that, because Iran firmly pursues an independent foreign policy. Iran will never, ever succumb to the threats and the diktats of Washington. And of course, Iran is the most important part, the most important cog in the resistance to Israeli aggression in the Middle East. And therein lies the reason why Britain especially, but also regrettably France and Germany, being strategic partners of America, are taking this approach. But this approach would not stand up in a legitimate court of law, because only a few days ago, inspectors from the IAEA were in Iran, and they were taken around the various nuclear facilities in the country, and no restrictions were placed on them. And those inspectors, had they have had restrictions placed on them, they would have made this very clear to the rest of the world, but they didn't. However, the British, the French, and the Germans, acting on behalf of America, being strategic partners to Washington, are attempting to portray Iran as being the reason for why the JCPOA is faltering. Well, the fault lies firmly with America, specifically the sanctions that America maintains to this very day on Iran. Those sanctions which were placed on Iran by the Trump administration after Trump withdrew America from the JCPOA. If the Europeans were sincere, truly sincere in their commitment to the JCPOA, they would come out publicly and call on America to do two things. Firstly, to rescind the Trump-era sanctions on Iran, and secondly, to rejoin the JCPOA. But then the French and the Germans really are not independent countries. They're only independent on paper, and that is a very painful reality. As for Britain, well, of course, Britain and America form the nucleus of the Anglo-Saxon world. So that is why the British are adopting this very deceitful and very menacing approach to Iran in relation to the JCPOA.
Okay. Well, as of the latest, if this is accurate enough for it to be the latest, you have the U.S., John Bosnich, that has said that it is prepared to remove sanctions on Iran to resume compliance with the Iran nuclear deal, including those that are inconsistent with the 2015 pact. And, quote, we are prepared to take the steps necessary to return to compliance with this. The problem is that there's so many sanctions that the U.S. has placed that it's in the hundreds, especially when Trump was in power, that Iran says those have to be lifted, period. So you have somewhat of a dead end in that respect. The U.S. keeps saying what it wants to say. Iran says you have to remove the sanctions. Do you think that the U.S. is consistent in its demand, knowing that Iran's not going to accept it, because it thinks that at some point Iran's going to give in, like a chess game here?
Well, it's definitely standard American policy. It's making demands on Iran, knowing that Iran was in compliance with the agreement, blaming Iran for America's unilateral withdrawal from the agreement. On the face of it, it's obvious that America is in the wrong. So when Germany, France, and England all continue to push the American line, it is an underlining of the fact of what Mr. Papadopoulos told us just a few moments ago, that these are not really independent countries, these are just puppet states. And as puppet states, they function as the mute dummy into which the ventriloquist is casting his voice. And the ventriloquist is Washington. Washington sends its voice over to its puppet leaders in these three countries, and they recite whatever they're told to do. If I were in Iranian government, I would be completely ignoring anything that they say. And I would also take into account another good point by my fellow commentator today, that the origin of this entire confrontation with Iran is not America, but Israel. And so we've got a double layer of control which you cannot penetrate because they are not responsive to your activities. And the only and the best solution is for Iran to replace the business that it did with America with business with other countries which are fair players by international law. Iran should turn even more than it has towards China. Iran should reserve all of its oil reserves for countries which are not destroying its entity as a country, and Iran should reorient its politics and its international affairs to avoid this. And I can give you the example of Russia, that was under U.S. sanctions for decades, and we now know that Russia has developed its own farming industry. Russia has developed replacement products and has become more economically viable after cutting off its relationship with the unfair dealers, and that's America and its colonies. So there is a time of trial ahead. But if Iran stays the course of being an independent country and not taking foreign dictates, you will be much better off than bowing to these foreign pressures.
Well, Marcus Papadopoulos, Iran has done what John Boston just said there, a 25-year deal with China that was revealed months ago. It is getting very close to Russia. It's Ebrahim Raisi, Iran's president, in his first overseas trip, is going to be traveling to Tajikistan, I believe, for the SCO summit, which since 2005, Iran has had an observer status, but it is pretty much confirmed that it's going to now be a member. So you have that movement there. At the same time, you have a new president and a new administration and a new lead negotiator. Abbas Araghchi was replaced just in the past 24, 48 hours. You have the Ali Bagheri, who has replaced him. And one analyst has said about Ali Bagheri, his appointment should be seen as a clear warning to the West, as it's likely that the new team will throw into question the whole basis of the nuclear deal and maybe abandon all of Iran's commitments if the Americans delay the return to the 2015 agreement. That is one analyst. That is not the government line. But Ali Bagheri's stance before it's pretty much clear how he has been against the JCPOA, because it's not, the benefits are not there as he sees it. Do you think that the U.S. administration is going to be on on watch here to heed this new administration and maybe have be lenient and remove sanctions for starters?
Well, let me say, first of all, that under no circumstances will America rescind any of the sanctions it currently has on Iran, including the sanctions placed on Iran by the Trump administration and the sanctions which preceded Trump coming to power. Indeed, the sanctions which go back to the 1980s. America's official goal is to destroy the Iranian revolution. It is to bring the Iranian state tumbling down, to return Iran to a client state, the state as it was during the days of the Tsar or of the Shah, when it was subservient, submissive to both America, Britain, and Israel. But let me go one step further in regard to Iran's relationship with Russia. It is not simply the case that Iran has a very close political relationship with Iran. No, Iran has a strategic partnership with the Russian Federation. And that is extremely important. Indeed, that in the last few years has changed the dynamics of the Middle East, because it means that Iran has a strategic relationship with one of the two superpowers in the world, as I said, namely Russia. That means that Iran's national security is extremely augmented as a result. And secondly, it gives the Iranian government even more confidence when pursuing its foreign policy objectives, not just in the Middle East, but across the wider region. And I believe that it is that, rather than the new administration in place in Tehran, that is a source of consternation for America. Because America sees the Middle East as having a new, although unofficial, alliance in it, an unofficial alliance comprising Russia, Syria, and Iran. Mm-hmm. The Americans know that their supremacy in the Middle East is not going to be ended by this unofficial alliance between Moscow, Damascus, and Tehran. Nonetheless, it is causing a lot of anxiety, a lot of worry for American policymakers. So it's not the case that the Americans are concerned about the new Iranian president and his new administration. It's the fact that Iran has a strategic partnership with Russia, like how America has a strategic partnership with Israel.
Sure. Last question, John Bosnish. You talked about how certain things that was being discussed or that you were saying are signs that this is going to lead up to war. Now, how could that happen if the U.S. is pretty much leaving the West Asian region, the Afghanistan debacle that happened, the pullout there, to focus on China, which it has been doing for some years now? Do you think that the U.S. is in any position to do something like that?
Okay, well, first things first, next door to the place where I'm here now in town is making a bit of noise, so I'm going to speak up to speak over them. The defeat of America in Afghanistan has opened the door for new American wars. It is not an end to the American war program. And Iran has been on the American target list for years. So I would suggest that this is a very dangerous time, and Iran has to be very, very careful about what America threatens to do. And remember that Israel is always ready to send America to war against Iran. I think that this is a dangerous time, but I do believe that Iran has to stay the course because the Iranian position here is the legal and correct position. I would suggest that you should tie preemptive legal action at the World Court. I think that these sanctions should be contested, and I believe that the United States should be put under every kind of international pressure, especially from friendly countries to Iran, including Russia and China, so that America knows that if it does take aggressive action against Iran, it will not just be facing Iran, it will be facing a series of interested and very concerned countries around the world.
Thank you. I'm sorry to jump in. We're just fresh out of time. Let me thank our guest, John Bosnish, journalist and political analyst from Belgrade. Thank you for your comments, John. Also, Marcus Papadopoulos, historian, political analyst, and author from London. And with that, we come to an end for this edition of The Spotlight. Thanks for watching. From Mikhail and entire team here in the capital, Tehran, it's goodbye.